On this episode of the Layover Live, Grant stops by to talk metrics that matter.
Yes, Jason, that is a very important thing to talk about.
Stoltz. What are you doing, man?
Oh, I just don't want to make any mistakes with my metrics.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 90 of the Layover Live, where we bring you the top article from the Layover each week. I'm Jason Swick, VP of Digital Marketing, joined by Grant Stoltz. Grant, welcome to the show again.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Happy to have you here. I'm not asking you to read off a script today, which is good. We make enough mistakes on the show. We don't need to make any of those kind of mistakes. But we are talking about a really good article that talks about making mistakes coming from Marketingland this week. And it's really around how we're measuring web performance. And I think one of the most important things that we measure as marketers is web performance. But this article really goes into and brings up really 3 examples of mistakes we make by looking at metrics in a certain way. So I want to leave that over to you. So let's first talk about what are some of the mistakes that this article talks about.
Yeah, I think the first one that they talk about there is using time on site as a metric. Interestingly enough, they call out one specific metric that I think we see as pretty common across the board, is using time on site as a measurement of success on websites. So they call that one out just front and center. They also call out using metrics without any other context. More specifically, in the example they give there is a revenue number. You know, I earned $10 million this year. With no context, that sounds great, but until you add in another thing, such as a benchmark of, well, actually your projected revenue was 100 million, all of a sudden 10 million doesn't sound so good. And the final thing they have on there is talking about using metrics and measuring metrics that have been measured just for the sake of measuring them that they've been measured in the past.
Right.
So it's historically, we've always used this to measure our performance, and let's keep doing that because that's the way it is. That is not a good way to go about measurement.
Very true. These are 3 mistakes. They give some pretty good ideas of solutions about those are common, and it is definitely common in the space we work at, right? I think of metrics that come to mind of looking at them just by themselves. I think of like bounce rate. Bounce rate by itself doesn't mean a whole lot. We hear that metric being measured a lot of times because there's so many other factors that go into bounce rate. But one they did measure, as we unpack this article a little bit, that you mentioned was time on site as a success metric. So what's the issue then, I think, with measuring that? Because that's probably going to be one that I think people watching this are going to be most curious about.
Yeah, definitely. So, time on site is a pretty common metric that we've seen, and is fairly common in the digital marketing industry, especially with web, as a success metric. And the issue they point out, and they give 3 really good examples in this article of why time on site is a bad metric. A couple examples, are if, let's say, a user opens your website in a tab and then goes to another tab, then goes back to your website, does a couple things, and then closes the session. Google Analytics will log that as about a 45-minute session or until that session is terminated. So what might on paper look like an amazing performance actually really isn't that good at all.
And Grant, I'm guilty of doing that. You know me. I have 9 million tabs open at any given time. I've been known to do that from time to time because I may open an article that I want to come read later. That kind of gives that false impression then, right?
Exactly. So that's one thing they caution against, is looking at that as a sheer success metric. And again, kind of to point 2 that they have, is not looking at it in a vacuum by itself.
Very true. So, we live in a mobile first world. Well, that doesn't mean, it may or may not mean a whole lot, right?
Exactly. So time on site may actually be better measured as something of a goal completion. However, time on site can be used as a good measure of engagement if that's what you're looking for on something like a blog post or a long form piece of content. But to again have that as the absolute line in the sand, not a great idea from that front.
Yeah, fair enough. Still an important metric, but shouldn't be looked at by itself. It should be looked at with other things like scroll depth, all those types of things. So then what can marketers do to properly determine what is performing well on their website then?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and really depends on what your end goals are. Again, if you're an e-commerce website or if you're a destination website, you're going to have 2 very different goal sets there potentially. So I think the biggest thing is looking at as close to the bottom of the funnel as you can get for those metrics. Again, like I mentioned, on an e-commerce website, they probably can track from entrance to website all the way through purchase. But on a destination website, it actually is a little more of a gray area. Did the user actually show up in a destination? Did they book a hotel? Did they go to a partner and spend money there? A little more difficult to tell. So my advice is always look at the metric that's closest to that end goal. So whether it's a partner referral, if you do have a booking engine, see if people are booking on that, and using those as measures of success of your website. But although, like we mentioned, keeping those other top-level metrics in mind, like time on site, pages per session, just to see how engaging your actual content on the website is, and again, that you're actually driving people to that final conversion.
And it's only telling part of the story, right? Still important to look at those high-level metrics, but looking at those alone is not what we want to do, right?
Correct.
So again, good advice on the article. It talks about using time on site to make page decisions by itself, not something that you really want to do. You want to look at other type of metrics in line with that, things like bounce rate, things like scroll depth. Those are all things to keep in mind. Not relying on any single metric by itself. Like I said, bounce rate by itself really doesn't mean a whole lot. So looking at it solely alone doesn't make a lot of sense, especially as how we engage and consume content today is very, very different. And then lastly, continuing to do those things that we've always done just because we've always done them. That's a mistake we often see a lot of times when we're talking with clients, even on our end, is that, hey, we measure it this way because we've been doing it for 20 years. That's not a good way to run a business. It's not a good way to run your marketing. The world changes, things change. The way even metrics are calculated oftentimes can change from one platform to the next. So doing things the same way just for the sake of doing them doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So Grant, good advice there. It's a really, really good article. Check it out. These are some common things that Grant and I do see often, as well as a lot of the analysts that work on our team as they're talking to clients, which is why this article really stood out to us this week. So thanks for tuning in each and every week. Grant, thanks for stopping by.
Course.
No reading next week.
No,
off
none.
the paper. Okay?
We're going off script.
Yeah, off script. It's next week, right? So if you're not subscribed to our channel now, please do. We really appreciate all of you attending each and every week. If you want to consume us through audio, you can consume us that way through Spotify or through iTunes, through podcast. Thanks for tuning in each and every week. We'll see you next time, and have a great day.